They told him to sit down, to stay quiet, to remember his place. But what happens when a man's voice is the only thing he has left and the world decides that voice is too dangerous to hear? Inside a crowded town hall, a black man stood at the microphone. His words weren't violent. They weren't hateful. They were true. And that truth made people shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some rolled their eyes, some whispered under their breath. And then came the command, "Your time is up. Sit down." But he didn't. He couldn't. Because in that moment, his silence would mean surrender. And instead, his voice sparked a movement that no one could stop. The city of Briarwood looked ordinary from the outside. Red-bricked buildings, narrow sidewalks lined with sycamore trees. Families moving through their daily routines as if everything was just fine. But under the surface, the same cracks that scarred America ran deep here too. And for Marcus Red, those cracks were visible every single day. Marcus wasn't a stranger to silence. He had grown up with it, teachers skipping over his raised hand in class, employers pretending they forgot to call him back after an interview, strangers stepping a little further away when he entered an elevator. These weren't loud forms of hatred. They weren't shouted slurs or open threats. They were quieter, subtle, but no less damaging. At 35, Marcus had become known in his community as the man who spoke for others. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a pastor. He was just a son, a father, and a neighbor who refused to pretend that everything was fine. His gift was his voice, measured, steady, and impossible to ignore when he chose to use it. It started with small meetings in church basements. A dozen people sitting in a circle, sharing stories about landlords who wouldn't rent to them, about traffic stops that ended in humiliation, about schools that seemed to give up on their children before they even had a chance. Marcus listened. He remembered every word. And when it was his turn to speak, he put those stories together like puzzle pieces, showing the bigger picture. The first time Marcus stood at a microphone in public, it wasn't planned. A community board had scheduled an open forum to discuss neighborhood development. On paper, it sounded harmless. But the truth was that new businesses were coming in, and longtime residents, mostly black families, were being quietly pushed out. Marcus hadn't signed up to speak. He sat in the back row, listening as one official after another painted a rosy picture of growth. Smiling men in suits promised jobs, promised safety, promised progress. But to Marcus, it sounded like the same story he had heard his entire life: progress for some, displacement for others. Then a woman stood up. Her voice trembled as she explained how her landlord had doubled her rent in a single year. She clutched her purse tightly, her eyes darting toward the door as if she already felt out of place. And when she sat down, the room stayed silent. That silence was too heavy for Marcus to bear. He stood, walked forward, and for the first time spoke into a microphone that wasn't meant for him. "Progress," he said, "is not progress if it erases the very people who built this neighborhood." The room shifted. Some nodded. Some frowned. The officials at the front exchanged quick glances, their smiles stiffening. But Marcus didn't stop. He spoke about his mother, who had cleaned houses in Briarwood for 30 years and still couldn't afford to live near her work. He spoke about the children who walked past construction sites, watching luxury condos rise on the same blocks where playgrounds had crumbled. His words weren't rehearsed. They poured out raw, sharp, and full of truth. And when he sat down, something had changed. People looked at each other differently, as if the silence that had always blanketed the room had been pierced, and now everyone could finally breathe. After that night, Marcus became a familiar presence. Not by choice, but because others kept asking him to speak, at schools, at community meetings, at vigils. His words carried weight because they weren't just his, they belonged to the voices that had been ignored for too long. Still, the resistance was quiet but firm. Officials stopped inviting him to meetings. Emails went unanswered. Local papers cropped him out of photos or quoted him only halfway. It was as if his words were too sharp, too inconvenient, too true. But Marcus understood. Racism rarely arrived as a storm. It seeped in like a slow leak. A polite smile paired with a dismissive gesture, a door that never fully opened. a clock that always seemed to run out of time the moment his voice began to matter. And in Briarwood, that leak was becoming a flood. One night, sitting at his kitchen table, Marcus scribbled down thoughts in a notebook. His daughter Lila was asleep in the next room. He thought about her future, about the kind of world she would inherit if silence continued to win. That thought hardened into something sharper than anger: determination. Marcus didn't want fame. He didn't want power. He wanted something simple: a chance to speak, a chance to be heard, a chance for truth to cut through the lies, even if it made people uncomfortable. And as he closed the notebook that night, he didn't know it yet, but the small cracks in Briarwood's silence were about to split wide open. Because soon he would face a room full of people who were determined to shut him down, and his choice to remain silent or to speak would ignite something far larger than Briarwood itself. The first attempt to silence Marcus didn't come with shouting. It came with procedure. It was a cold Thursday evening when he walked into the town hall. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old wood, the kind of place where decisions had been made for decades without voices like his ever being welcomed. On the agenda was public comment, but as Marcus signed his name on the clipboard, the clerk gave him a tight smile. Her eyes flicked over the sheet, then down at her watch. "You'll have 2 minutes," she said flatly. Marcus nodded. He knew the rules. But rules, he realized, had a way of shifting when his voice was involved. When his turn came, he stepped to the microphone. He began calmly, talking about the rise in traffic stops against black drivers in Briarwood. His words were steady, but behind them was a fire that couldn't be ignored. He listed numbers. He told stories. He reminded the board that these were fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters, not statistics. And then, right as he built to his point, a gavel slammed. "Sir, your time is up." The voice belonged to Councilman Harris, a man who had built his career on charm and polished speeches. Harris leaned back in his chair, his smile smug. "We thank you for your comments." The words weren't gratitude. They were dismissal. The room went still. Some people clapped lightly, more out of politeness than support. Marcus stood frozen, the weight of his unspoken words burning in his chest. He wanted to continue, but the officials were already moving on, calling the next speaker. He walked back to his seat, each step heavy, but something inside him hardened. If they thought 2 minutes would contain him, they were wrong. Over the next weeks, Marcus kept showing up. And each time the pattern repeated. He spoke. They cut him off. He spoke again. They shuffled papers, avoided his gaze, pretended not to hear. But outside those walls, his voice carried further than they expected. A clip of him speaking cut off mid-sentence circulated online. Someone had filmed it on their phone. In the video, his voice stopped, but his face said everything: frustration, dignity, defiance. That clip spread across social media, reaching thousands in just a few days. And with it came a question whispered across Briarwood. Why are they afraid of what he has to say? At first, the pushback was subtle. An anonymous letter slipped under his door. Be careful. A stranger's car parked across from his house at odd hours. Anonymous comments online calling him angry, ungrateful, or worse. But Marcus didn't stop. He couldn't. At a rally in the town square, he stood on a wooden crate, his voice carrying over the crowd. They want us quiet, he said, because silence protects their comfort. But our silence has cost us too much already. The crowd roared. It wasn't just his words, it was he said them, as if every syllable carried the weight of generations who had been told the same thing. Sit down. Be quiet. Know your place. But resistance breeds resistance. Councilman Harris and others began to push back harder. At the next town hall, they moved the public comment session to the very end of the meeting, after most of the audience had left. They changed the rules requiring written remarks to be submitted in advance. They limited the microphone's volume, so his words barely reached the back of the room. It was no accident. And yet, every obstacle only seemed to make Marcus stronger. His speeches grew sharper, his voice more urgent. People who had once stayed silent began standing beside him. Mothers who had lost sons to unjust arrests. Workers who had been denied promotions. Students tired of being ignored in classrooms. Still, the tension thickened. One night, after another meeting where Marcus was cut off mid-sentence, he walked into the parking lot. The air was icy, his breath visible under the flickering streetlights. And there, leaning against his car, stood two men he didn't recognize. Their arms folded, their expressions cold. "You should slow down," one said quietly. "People don't like troublemakers." Marcus stared at them. His hands trembled, not out of fear, but out of anger, the kind that seeps deep into your bones. He didn't respond. He simply unlocked his car, slid inside, and drove away. But the message was clear. They weren't just trying to silence him inside the town hall. They wanted to silence him everywhere. At home that night, Marcus sat at his kitchen table again, staring at the same notebook. He thought of Lila asleep in her room. Thought of how easily voices like his had been erased throughout history. Thought of how comfortable silence was for everyone but the people living with its cost. And for the first time, Marcus wondered, would speaking cost him more than his words could give back? The tension had reached a breaking point. The officials wanted him gone. The people wanted him louder. And Marcus stood in the middle, his voice a bridge that threatened to collapse under the weight of both sides. But deep down, he knew one truth. The next time they tried to silence him, he would not stop talking. The breaking point came on a night that was supposed to be routine, a town hall meeting, packed tighter than usual. Folding chairs filled every corner of the room, the air buzzing with a strange mix of impatience and anticipation. Something was different. People weren't just waiting for updates on zoning laws or development projects. They were waiting for him. Marcus felt it the moment he stepped inside. Eyes followed him, some filled with hope, others with hostility. His daughter, Lila, sat near the back with a neighbor, her small hands clutching a notebook where she had started scribbling her own words. She was only 10, but she understood enough. Her father's voice mattered, and tonight it would be tested. The agenda dragged on, speaker after speaker reading from scripts, their voices monotone. But beneath the dull rhythm, tension coiled tighter, like a rope about to snap. And then at last the moderator announced, "Public comment." Marcus walked to the front. His footsteps echoed in the silence. He adjusted the microphone, took a breath, and began. At first, his voice was calm. He spoke about housing evictions, about families forced into shelters, about children displaced from schools. He had the facts, the numbers. But soon, his words shifted, turning from statistics into something more human, more piercing. They want to tell us our struggles are isolated, that what happens to one family has nothing to do with another. But I am here to tell you, your struggle is mine, your silence is my silence. And if they silence me tonight, they silence all of us. A ripple spread across the room. People leaned forward, their eyes locked on him. He was no longer just Marcus Ridd, he was a mirror reflecting their buried anger, their buried hope. And that's when it happened. The gavel struck hard. Bang. "Mr. Reed," Councilman Harris barked, his voice sharp and final, "your time is up. Sit down." But Marcus didn't move. His hands gripped the podium. His chest heaved, but his voice didn't falter. "No," he said quietly, but it carried across the room like thunder. "I will not sit down. Not while people are being erased." The council members shifted uncomfortably. Papers rustled. A security guard began walking toward him. The crowd stirred. Some shouted, "Let him speak." Others whispered nervously, as if afraid of what might happen next. But Marcus kept going, his words cutting through the noise. "You can shut off this microphone. You can bang that gavel until your hand breaks, but my voice does not belong to you. My voice belongs to the people who have been told they don't matter. And you will not erase them, not tonight. Not ever." The guard reached him, placing a hand on his arm. But Marcus didn't flinch. He turned slightly, meeting the man's eyes, and for a brief second, the guard hesitated. Because what Marcus was saying wasn't just words, it was conviction made flesh. "History," Marcus said, his voice rising, "will not remember the minutes you keep or the rules you bend. It will remember whether we had the courage to speak when speaking costs the most. And I am speaking tonight not for me, but for every single one of us who has been told to be quiet." The room erupted. cheers, applause, shouts of solidarity that drowned out the gavel slamming again and again. Harris's face reddened, his polished mask cracking under the weight of defiance he couldn't control. "Remove him," Harris shouted. 2 guards stepped forward this time. They gripped Marcus's arms, trying to pull him away from the microphone. But as they dragged him back, he shouted one last sentence, his voice soaring above the chaos. "You cannot silence a truth that has already been spoken." The words hung in the air even as his body was pulled toward the door. People stood, some chanting his name, others raising fists, their voices filling the void where his had been cut off. Layla leapt to her feet, clutching her notebook to her chest, her eyes wide with both fear and pride. She saw her father not just as a man being silenced, but as a man refusing to surrender. Outside, under the harsh glow of streetlights, Marcus stood with his heart pounding. His body trembled, adrenaline still coursing through him. The guards released him with warnings, muttered under their breath, but it didn't matter. The door shut behind him, muffling the chaos inside. And in that silence, Marcus realized something profound. Tonight wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been cut off, talked over, dismissed, or erased. And now, because he had refused to sit down, others were standing up. The choice he had made to speak when ordered to be silent was no longer just defiance. It was the spark of a movement that no one in Briarwood could contain. The fallout came fast. By the next morning, the video was everywhere. Someone in the audience had captured it on their phone, the gavel slamming, the guards dragging Marcus away, and his final words echoing like a battle cry, "You cannot silence a truth that has already been spoken." It spread through social media with wildfire speed. Within hours, the clip had been shared thousands of times. People who had never set foot in Briarwood knew his name. Marcus Reed was no longer just a neighbor, a father, a voice at a microphone. He was a symbol. But symbols come with weight. The praise was immediate. Strangers messaged him words of gratitude, calling him brave, a leader, a fighter. Local activists reached out, asking him to speak at their rallies. Students spray-painted his words across abandoned buildings. "You cannot silence the truth." For the first time, Marcus felt what it meant to be heard, not just in a room, but across a city. And yet, just as quickly the backlash began. City officials called him disruptive. A local newspaper ran an editorial describing him as dangerous rhetoric disguised as community concern. Online trolls filled his inbox with hate. His phone rang late at night with blocked numbers, voices hissing racial slurs before hanging up. One morning, as Marcus walked Lila to school, he noticed a word spray-painted on the sidewalk near their home, "Troublemaker." The letters were jagged, angry. Lila saw it too. She squeezed his hand tighter, her eyes searching his face for answers. "Does this mean we're in danger?" she asked quietly. Marcus swallowed hard. He wanted to say no. He wanted to promise her safety, but the truth stuck in his throat. Instead, he knelt, looked her in the eye, and said, "It means some people are scared of what happens when we stop being quiet. But scared people can't stop the truth, baby. Remember that." Still, the fear was real. Grocery store trips turned into whispers behind his back. Old friends crossed the street instead of waving hello. Even his job was at risk. His boss warned him gently that bringing too much attention could make the company nervous. Marcus lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts heavy. Was he putting too much on the line? Was he risking Lila's future for a fight that could crush them both? But then he remembered the faces in that town hall. The cheers, the fists raised, the fire in people's eyes when they realized they weren't alone. And he knew this was no longer just his fight. So he pressed forward. A week later, a rally filled Briarwood Central Square. Hundreds gathered, families, workers, students, elders. Hand-painted signs waved above the crowd. "Let him speak. Silence is violence." And at the front, standing on a makeshift stage, Marcus gripped the microphone. He could feel the eyes of the city on him, supporters, critics, enemies, allies. The weight was heavy, but his voice was steady. "They tried to silence me," he began. "But what they don't understand is this: when you silence one voice, 1,000 others rise to take its place? Look around you. Look at us. We are not quiet. We are not broken. We are not going away. The crowd roared, their voices echoing off the buildings like thunder. But inside City Hall, officials watched the rally through glass windows with growing unease. Marcus wasn't just speaking anymore, he was galvanizing. Every word he spoke planted seeds that no gavel, no guard, no smear campaign could uproot. And yet, the cost continued to climb. At night, Marcus found threats taped to his car windshield. Neighbors warned him of strangers asking questions about his routine. Even at home, the phone rang with silence on the other end, long and deliberate. Layla began drawing pictures of her father at a microphone, surrounded by crowds. But in the corner of every drawing, she added something small, a shadowy figure watching. Even a child could sense the danger lurking around them. The weight of it pressed on Marcus's chest like stone. Each speech, each rally, each chant of his name only made the target on his back larger. He felt both stronger and more vulnerable than ever before. And yet, through it all, his resolve sharpened. Because every threat only proved his point. Every smear only revealed the truth they wanted hidden. One night, as he closed his notebook after another long day of writing, Marcus whispered to himself, "They think consequences will break me. But consequences are the proof that my voice matters." The cost was high, his peace, his safety, his anonymity. All of it was slipping away. But Marcus knew the truth. The consequences of speaking out were heavy. The consequences of silence were unbearable. The movement was no longer a whisper in Briarwood. It was a roar. Everywhere Marcus went, he saw signs of it. A mural painted on the side of a corner store, his silhouette at the microphone, beneath the words, *, truth cannot be silenced. Students wore buttons with his initials. Churches read his words aloud in Sunday sermons. Even those who had once avoided him now nodded in quiet respect as he passed. But with recognition came responsibility. Marcus felt it in his bones. The fight was bigger than him now. He wasn't just speaking for himself, or even just for Briarwood. He was carrying the weight of a movement that stretched far beyond one city. And he knew he couldn't do it alone. So he began to step back, not from the cause, but from the spotlight. At community meetings, he passed the microphone to others. A mother whose son had been stopped by police. A worker who'd been denied promotions. A teenager who'd been told her voice didn't matter. Marcus knew true power wasn't in one voice, but in many. Still, the city officials kept trying to crush it. They tightened rules on public gatherings. They threatened fines for unauthorized demonstrations. Councilman Harris even went on television, dismissing Marcus and his supporters as loud but misguided. But Harris's words fell flat. Because by now, people had seen too much. They had seen Marcus dragged away, yet refusing to be silent. They had seen crowds grow louder after every attempt to shut them down. They had seen truth spoken boldly, without apology. The tide had turned. One night, a rally filled the town square, again larger than any before. Families spilled into the streets. Music played. Candles flickered in the dark. It wasn't just protest anymore. It was community. It was hope made visible. Marcus stood at the edge of the crowd, his daughter Lila beside him. She tugged at his sleeve, her eyes wide as she watched the scene unfold. "Daddy," she whispered, "they're not just listening to you anymore. They're listening to each other." He smiled, the weight of her words sinking deep. She was right. His voice had started the spark, but it was no longer the fire. The people were. When he finally stepped up to the microphone, the crowd fell silent, not out of fear, but respect. His voice, steady and warm, carried across the square. "They tried to silence me. And in doing so, they awakened something far greater than they imagined. This movement is not mine. It is yours, it is ours. It belongs to every person who has been told their voice doesn't matter. And tonight we prove that it does." The cheers shook the ground. And as he looked out at the sea of faces, neighbors, friends, strangers, Elias Marcus felt something he hadn't in a long time. Not just resistance, not just defiance, but possibility. Because this was no longer the story of one man standing at a microphone. This was the story of a community refusing to be erased. A story of a people who discovered that silence was never safety and that their voices joined together were unstoppable. For Marcus, the journey had cost much: his peace, his safety, his anonymity. But as he held Lila's hand, watching her beam with pride, he knew it had given back something even greater, a future where her voice, and the voices of her generation, would never again be told to sit down. The movement was alive, and it was just beginning. In the end, Marcus's story was never just about one man refusing to be silent. It was about what happens when truth is spoken in the face of power, and how that truth can ripple far beyond a single room, a single city, a single moment. Silence protects systems, it shields injustice. But a single voice, steady and unyielding, can crack that silence wide open. Marcus proved that courage is not the absence of fear, it is choosing to speak when fear demands silence. And the movement he sparked reminds us all: voices cannot be chained, dignity cannot be erased, and truth cannot be buried. This was not just his fight, it is ours. Because every time someone says, "Sit down, be quiet," we must decide to rise and speak louder. This is Everyday Racism Drama.